the seventh step of exegesis, we continue to consider applications. As much as application, I would think of this step as the one where we really appropriate the biblical text. And I mean appropriate not in any negative sense, but in the original sense of simply making it our own. Again, the Bible may not have been written to us, but it was written for us, and so we enter into its story, and its story becomes ours, and its story becomes the lens through which we view the world and our own story. The early church had a twofold method for interpreting Scripture. The Apostle Paul calls it the letter and the spirit in passages like 2 Corinthians 3:6. That is, Scripture was read on both the literal level and the spiritual or mystical level. And that distinction was key. In other words, along with the literal sense, which I've associated with the historical critical interpretation and all the historical background questions, the pre-modern church unanimously recognized a second spiritual sense. Building on that key distinction, the medieval church expanded the categories of the spiritual meaning into three levels. And thus there were together four senses or meanings of Scripture. They called this the quadriga, the Latin word for the four-horse chariot of ancient Rome. Reflecting on these four senses may help us clarify the proximate aims of biblical interpretation for the church today. So first, again, they call it literal. It is the letter, the description of what happened or what the text plainly says. And this corresponds to the historical meaning of the text. What does it mean in its historical and literary context? That's the first meaning of Scripture in the most basic sense that everyone can kind of wrap their minds around. That's where we should start. The following spiritual senses are three ways of speaking of that one spiritual sense. Okay, so you've got the letter and the spirit, and then under spirit, there are these three senses that are all based on the literal sense and flow from it, but they relate to spiritual application and appropriation. The assumption is that the Bible is given for the church and for the nurturing of the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And these three spiritual senses have been identified with these following terms. If you like what you've heard and you want more, visit christian-studies.org and subscribe to the video course on understanding the Bible. And while you're there, check out our journal and other content from the Center for Christian Studies.